Some cars are strange, some are ugly, but these take it to a whole new level. They're the designs that made no sense, the engineering ideas that should have stayed on paper, and the automotive oddities that leave you shaking your head. You won't believe they were actually built, but every one of them is real. Today, we bring you the 12 stupidest cars. You won't believe these ridiculous flops, bizarre experiments, and unforgettable mistakes on wheels. Watch till the end, and don't forget to subscribe.
The 1933 Fuller Dimaxian Replica, built by a small, overly optimistic Illinois coach builder, was a strange chapter in America's long history of copying a good idea badly. By the early 1930s, Buckminster Fuller's original Dimaxian car had made national headlines as a radical vision of the future. Streamlined, teardrop-shaped, with 3 wheels, rear steering, and a claimed ability to carry more passengers and go faster than any conventional automobile. It looked like something out of a science fiction magazine at a time when most cars still had exposed fenders and upright grills. Naturally, in the depths of the Great Depression, someone thought they could make a cheaper, more accessible Dimaxian for the masses. What they ended up making was a rolling nightmare. The Illinois builder's approach was essentially make it look weird enough to get attention, but build it on the absolute cheapest budget possible. The body, like Fuller's, had a long, narrow teardrop shape, but instead of carefully engineered steel framing, this replica was made using cheap wooden beams covered in thin metal skin. The cost-cutting was immediately obvious, not just in the crude panel fitment and wavy body lines, but in how the entire structure flexed when it went over bumps. Doors sometimes shifted just enough mid-drive that they needed to be slammed again before they'd latch. It gave passengers the unnerving feeling that the car might fold in half under hard braking. The real engineering disaster came in the choice of running gear. Instead of the custom-built, carefully balanced setup Fuller had designed, the replica builder used whatever was lying around his shop. 2 salvaged Model A Ford spindles up front, and, for the single rear wheel, a massive, heavy-duty truck axle with a primitive leaf spring mount. This made the car's weight balance absurdly rear-heavy, exaggerating the instability that already plagued rear steer designs. Every bump or pothole sent the tail twitching, and on narrow city streets, simply turning into an alley could turn into a full wrestling match with the steering wheel. The steering itself was its own comedy. Rear-wheel steering is tricky even in the best of circumstances, but here it was sluggish, vague, and had so much play in the linkage that sometimes you needed to start turning the wheel several seconds before you actually wanted to change direction. Parking was almost impossible. Drivers often had to make 3 or 4 slow, awkward corrections just to pull into a spot. And if you tried to stop suddenly in mid-turn, the top-heavy rear end could lift slightly, and the whole car felt like it was about to fall sideways. According to a surviving anecdote from a local mechanic who witnessed a test drive, it didn't just understeer or oversteer, it kind of fell oversteer. The builder originally hoped to take it to county fairs and small-town exhibitions, hoping the futuristic look would lure in wealthy buyers. But during its first public test, it scared potential customers more than it impressed them. A local newspaper described it politely as a brave attempt at streamlining that will require further refinement. Privately, onlookers called it that upside-down canoe on wheels. After 1 or 2 humiliating outings, the coach builder quietly rolled the ungainly machine behind his workshop, where it sat under a tarp, gathering dust and wasps. It never got a second prototype, never received a buyer, and never even received a proper name beyond that Dimaxian knockoff. Sometime in the early 1940s, with wartime scrap drives in full swing, it was hauled off to the scrapyard, probably with more relief than regret from its creator. It's a perfect example of Depression-era optimism clashing with harsh mechanical reality. The real Dimaxian was already difficult to drive and years ahead of road infrastructure, but at least it was thoughtfully engineered. This Illinois copy stripped away the engineering and kept only the gimmick, proving that sometimes the worst thing you can do with an ambitious idea is try to make it cheap. If you'd like, I can also tell you about the very few surviving photographs and the rumored second half-built chassis that may have ended up in a barn in Peoria. The 1940 Graham Page Hollywood was one of those cars born not from innovation or market research, but from sheer financial desperation. By the late 1930s, Graham Page was on life support. Once a respected independent automaker, they had been battered by the Great Depression, squeezed by the Big Three, and plagued by dwindling sales. They needed something fresh to save the brand, but they didn't have the money to design a new car from scratch. That's when someone in the boardroom had the brilliant idea: buy up leftover bodies from the recently defunct Cord 810, 812 and give them a cheap facelift. The result was the Graham Hollywood, a car that looked like the ghost of the legendary Cord had been dragged through a bad cartoon. The Cord 810 was one of the most beautiful and innovative cars of the 1930s. With its low-slung stance, hidden headlights, and front-wheel drive layout. But Graham didn't buy complete Cords. They bought unfinished bodies and re-engineered them to fit Graham's rear-wheel drive chassis. This immediately threw off the proportions that made the Cord elegant in the first place. The Cord's gracefully sloping hood had been designed for a compact front-drive engine bay. Now, Graham's engineers had to cram in a bulkier conventional drivetrain, raising the ride height and stretching the nose into a long, awkward beak. To make things worse, Graham replaced Cord's sleek louvered grille with a bulbous, toad-like front end, complete with vertical bars that seemed almost cartoonish. The design changes were meant to make the car look more modern, but in reality, it looked like a Cord that had been left out in the rain and then inflated like a balloon. From the side, the proportions were even stranger. The high rear deck and thick fenders clashed with the narrow greenhouse, making it look as if someone had grafted two different cars together. The Hollywood's performance was a letdown. The Cord had been ahead of its time, but the Graham version had to make do with an older, supercharged six-cylinder driving the rear wheels. It was neither as powerful as the Cord's best V8s, nor as smooth, and the heavy body blunted any sense of sportiness. Buyers who might have been seduced by the Cord's reputation for innovation quickly discovered the Hollywood was slower, less refined, and lacking the engineering brilliance of its predecessor. Quality control was another sore point. The Cord bodies Graham purchased had been sitting in storage for years, some partially assembled, others incomplete. Panel gaps were inconsistent, doors didn't always align properly, and the complex curves of the Cord design made repainting and finishing expensive. Dealers often complained that cars arrived looking like they'd already been through a few winters, and some had mismatched panels where Graham had to cobble together parts from different body shells. Sales were disastrous. While Graham hoped the Hollywood's glamorous name and resemblance to the famous Cord would lure buyers, most people saw it for what it was, a recycled relic awkwardly updated to pass for new. Prices had to be slashed to move inventory, and some Hollywoods reportedly sat unsold until the U.S. entered World War II. In some cases, dealers essentially gave them away, bundling them into package deals with commercial trucks or fleet orders just to clear space. By 1941, Graham Page was finished as a passenger car manufacturer, retreating into building wartime goods. The Hollywood, instead of being the savior of the company, became its final swan song, a strange, sad footnote in American automotive history. Today, surviving examples are rare and often cherished by collectors, but mostly as conversation pieces. They're rolling reminders that you can't simply slap a new nose on an old legend and expect the magic to return. I can also tell you the amusing story of one Hollywood that sat in a Nebraska dealership window for almost 6 years because the owner refused to discount it. Would you like to hear it? The 1954 Hudson Jet stands today as one of the most fascinating examples of a well-meaning but utterly doomed corporate gamble in post-war American automotive history. A car that was supposed to save a company, but instead helped speed it toward its grave. In the early 1950s, Hudson Motor Car Company was respected for its full-sized step-down sedans, which had been engineering marvels when introduced in 1948. They were lower, safer, and handled better than most cars of their era. And Hudson's Hornet models became racing legends in NASCAR thanks to their low center of gravity and torquey inline sixes. But while Hudson was king on the track, it was losing ground in the showroom. By 1952-53, Ford and Chevrolet were selling cars in unprecedented volumes. Chrysler was gaining ground, and independent automakers like Hudson, Studebaker, and Nash were fighting for survival. Hudson's leadership concluded that the way forward wasn't bigger cars. It was smaller, more affordable compacts. This was the logic that birthed the Hudson Jet, a car aimed directly at the growing market for economical transportation. The idea wasn't bad. Post-war America was indeed showing signs of interest in smaller, thriftier cars, thanks in part to rising urban congestion and the arrival of imports like Volkswagen. But the execution of the Jet's design was hamstrung from day one by micromanagement from Hudson president A.E. Barrett, who imposed his own ideas over the objections of his design team. Barrett's vision for the Jet ignored the market trends toward low, sleek, stylish cars. He insisted on a high roofline so that women wearing large hats could ride comfortably without removing them. He wanted large, upright windows for visibility, even if they broke the car's proportions. He demanded a conservative, squared-off body that he thought would appeal to older, respectable buyers. The designers, led by Frank Spring, fought for something more modern and streamlined. There was even an early prototype with graceful lines that would have rivaled Studebaker's clean styling. But Barrett reportedly took one look at it and said it looked too European and foreign. The sleek proposal was thrown out, and the Jet's final shape became a short, tall, boxy sedan that looked awkwardly formal for its intended price bracket. Critics later called it a refrigerator on wheels, a shoebox with chrome, and most memorably, a shrunken funeral car. Mechanically, Hudson overbuilt the Jet. Instead of embracing lightweight construction for fuel economy and agility, the company gave it a heavy, rigid body and a flathead six-cylinder engine that, while smooth and durable, struggled to move the car with much enthusiasm. The car's curb weight was so high that in some trims it was heavier than certain full-sized Fords or Chevrolets, which immediately killed one of its supposed advantages. Performance wasn't disastrous, but it was sluggish, and its fuel economy advantage over larger cars was minimal, a fatal flaw when customers could simply buy a bigger, better-looking Ford or Chevy for the same or less money. The pricing was perhaps the Jet's most baffling mistake. Hudson positioned it as a premium compact, meaning it cost hundreds of dollars more than rivals like the Nash Rambler or Studebaker Champion, and in some cases, more than a base model Ford Custom Line or Chevy 210, cars that were faster, roomier, and far more stylish. For frugal buyers, the Jet was too expensive. For style-conscious buyers, it was too frumpy. For performance-minded buyers, it was too slow. It existed in a no-man's land of appeal. Hudson spent heavily on marketing, trying to spin the Jet as sophisticated, solidly built, and upscale for its size. But the American car-buying public in the early 1950s didn't want an expensive small car from a company known for big sedans. Dealers began struggling to move them almost immediately, and soon Hudson lots were filling with unsold inventory. A few dealers resorted to heavily discounting Jets just to get them off the lot, which only hurt the brand's prestige further. Worse still, the Jet siphoned resources away from Hudson's profitable Hornet line, leaving those larger cars outdated against rapidly modernizing competition. The gamble had been that the Jet would open a whole new sales channel for Hudson. Instead, it alienated the company's loyal customers and failed to attract enough new ones. By 1954, the losses were staggering, and Hudson was teetering on the edge of collapse. The only lifeline came in the form of a merger with Nash Kelvinator, forming American Motors Corporation. In hindsight, many automotive historians argue that the Jet's failure wasn't inevitable. It was the result of poor design decisions, bad timing, and a misunderstanding of what compact car buyers actually wanted. Had Hudson gone with the sleeker, lighter design proposed by its styling department and priced the car competitively, it might have been an early success story in the compact market. Instead, it became an object lesson in how a stubborn executive vision can override market reality. Today, surviving Hudson Jets are rare, partly because so few were built, and partly because so many were driven into the ground or scrapped. When one turns up at a car show, it tends to draw a crowd, not because it's beautiful, but because it's a tangible piece of automotive what were they thinking history. Collectors sometimes prize them as conversation pieces, and a few enthusiasts even restore them lovingly. But for most people, the Jet remains a quirky, awkward footnote in Detroit's long history of ambitious misfires. I can also go into the alternate history what-if scenario of what Hudson's sleeker, never-built Jet prototype might have looked like and how it could have changed the company's fate, a story that's almost more interesting than the Jet itself. Would you like me to?
The 1957 Mercury Turnpike Cruiser is one of those cars that could only have come from the height of Detroit's chrome-drunk space-age optimism, a time when engineers and stylists were locked in a friendly arms race to see who could create the most gadgets and the most flamboyant sheet metal. It was supposed to be Mercury's ultimate prestige car, a rolling showcase of mid-century innovation that would compete head-on with the best from Buick, Oldsmobile, and Chrysler. And in some ways, it really was an engineering tour de force. But it was also a case study in what happens when a company throws every possible gimmick at a car without thinking too hard about whether those features make sense in the real world. The Turnpike Cruiser name came from the brand sponsorship of the 1956 to 1957 Florida Turnpike dedication ceremonies, an event that Mercury's marketing department milked for all it was worth. The car itself was introduced at the 1957 model year lineup as Mercury's new flagship, sitting above the Montclair. It was big, bold, and stuffed with technology that the company bragged was years ahead of its time. Buyers got an automatic push-button transmission selector mounted on a pod that jutted from the dashboard, twin radio antennas, and a power rear window called the breezeway, a reverse slant pane that could be lowered for ventilation. It also came with a dizzying array of chrome moldings, scalloped trim, and massive tail fins capped with anodized gold accents that looked like they'd been borrowed from a Buck Rogers prop department. At first glance, the Turnpike Cruiser seemed like a dream car for gadget lovers. Alongside the push-button transmission and breezeway window, there were also memory seats, a seat-o-matic that automatically returned to a preset position when the driver got in, a deep dish safety steering wheel, and a monitor control panel, a strange glass-topped dash display with warning lights for speed, fuel, and engine condition. In 1957, this was borderline science fiction. Mercury's brochure showed happy couples cruising down new highways, sun glinting off all that chrome, with captions promising that the Turnpike Cruiser was built for the future. Unfortunately, reality had other ideas. The breezeway window, while clever in concept, had one very big flaw. Opening it while driving often created a low-pressure zone inside the cabin that drew exhaust fumes directly into the passenger compartment, especially if you had the front windows cracked at the same time. Drivers reported headaches, nausea, and a distinct smell of carbon monoxide. Not exactly the futuristic comfort Mercury had in mind. The push-button transmission system, while novel, was prone to sticking or misaligning, and more than a few owners complained that it was hard to tell if the car was actually in gear. Then there was the styling. Even in an era famous for excess, when Cadillac was sprouting fins, Chrysler was sprouting wings, and Oldsmobile was covering everything in chrome, the Turnpike Cruiser managed to look over the top. The roofline had strange wraparound butterfly roof pillars with plexiglass inserts, meant to give a more open view, but they just made the roof look fussy and awkward. The tail fins were tall, sharply angled, and topped with chrome rockets that seemed like they'd been borrowed from a Buck Rogers prop department. The gold anodized trim, while flashy in the showroom, faded badly in the sun. Some owners joked that the Turnpike Cruiser was 3 cars wide and 5 cars long, and parking when in a tight spot was a nerve-wracking experience. The mechanicals were sound enough. Under the hood was a 368 cubic inch V8 making 290 horsepower, but the car's sheer size and weight made it a thirsty, somewhat lumbering machine. Gas mileage could drop into the single digits if you were heavy on the throttle. And while Mercury marketed it as a high-speed highway cruiser, the suspension tuning leaned towards soft comfort, which meant that hard cornering produced body roll dramatic enough to make passengers grab for the armrests. Despite its faults, the Turnpike Cruiser wasn't a complete sales flop. Around 23,000 were built for 1957, including both 2-door and 4-door models. But it quickly developed a reputation as a car for people who liked flash over substance. Even in its own time, critics in automotive magazines found the styling overwrought, and owners quietly admitted that many of the flashy features were things they stopped using after the first month. Today, surviving Turnpike Cruisers have a strange kind of appeal. In the eyes of collectors, they're rolling monuments to mid-century optimism, a perfect example of how far Detroit would go to make a car look futuristic. At a classic car show, one will stop people in their tracks, partly from its sheer size and partly from the "what on earth is that" factor. But they're also reminders of the downside of the gadget-obsessed 1950s, technology that sounded great in ads but caused headaches, literally and figuratively, in real life. If you like, I could also tell you about the even rarer 1957 Turnpike Cruiser Pace Car Edition, which managed to be even stranger than the standard model. That one's a whole other story. The 1960 Ford Townis 17M, in its U.S. spec import form, is one of those fascinating footnotes in American automotive history. A car that technically existed here, but left such a faint and unimpressive mark that even seasoned car buffs sometimes look at you sideways when you mention it. This was Ford's attempt to bring one of its European market models across the Atlantic and plug it into the growing small car segment in America. On paper, the idea made sense. Volkswagen was selling Beetles in droves, Renault and Peugeot were carving out niches, and Detroit's Big Three were starting to experiment with compacts like the Falcon, Corvair, and Valiant. Ford thought it could simply pluck a model from its German lineup and slot it in below its U.S. offerings. What they got instead was a masterclass in how not to introduce a foreign-built car to American buyers. The Townis name had been around in Europe since the late 1930s, named after the Townis mountain range in Germany, and by 1960, the 17M was Ford of Germany's mainstream family sedan. In Europe, it was considered stylish, modern, and reasonably comfortable. But in its U.S. spec trim, the car arrived with all the wrong ingredients for success. First, the styling. The 1960 Townis 17M borrowed heavily from late 1950s American Ford design language, with tail fins, heavy chrome accents, and a toothy grille. But it was all condensed into smaller, rounder proportions. The result looked less like a sleek import and more like someone had left a full-sized '59 Ford sedan in the dryer too long. From some angles, it resembled a caricature, a cartoon Ford that might have been drawn for a European comic strip. American buyers who wanted a small car tended to prefer something distinctly different from Detroit's styling excesses, which is why the clean, unadorned VW Beetle appealed to them. The Townis, ironically, looked too Detroit for its own good. Then there was the performance, or lack thereof. Under the hood sat a 1.7-liter V4 engine producing around 60 horsepower, mated to either a 3-speed column-shift manual or a 4-speed in some trims. In Europe, that was perfectly adequate for city driving and 60 to 65 mile-per-hour cruising.
In America, where highway speeds were higher and distances longer, the Townis felt asthmatic. Merging onto an interstate was a white-knuckle exercise, and passing a slow-moving truck required planning that bordered on strategic military operations. Road testers at the time noted that the engine buzzed loudly at highway speeds, and while the ride quality was decent, the steering was vague, especially by American standards. And then came the price problem. Because the Townis was built in Germany and imported, it was subject to shipping costs and tariffs that pushed its sticker price well above that of homegrown compacts. In 1960, you could buy a brand new Ford Falcon with a 6-cylinder engine and more interior room for less money than a Townis 17M. That meant the Townis wasn't competing with VW Beetles and Renault Dauphines. It was competing with bigger, more powerful American cars that were cheaper. Unsurprisingly, that was not a winning formula. Ford's marketing didn't help either. Instead of leaning into the car's European engineering or frugality, US ads awkwardly tried to present it as a stylish alternative to domestic compacts. But the pitch didn't land. The Townis lacked the quirky charm that made other imports stand out, and it didn't have the low-cost or bulletproof reliability reputation that could offset its modest performance. Sales were dismal. Ford brought in only a small number, and by the early 1960s, the Townis experiment in America was quietly abandoned. Most dealers didn't want them on their lots, and many of the ones that were sold ended up in the hands of second or third owners who found it nearly impossible to source replacement parts. Mechanics unfamiliar with the German Ford's layout were often baffled by its differences from American Fords, leading to higher repair costs and long wait times for even simple fixes. Today, the US-spec 1960 Ford Townis 17M is so rare on American soil that spotting one at a car show is like seeing a unicorn with a license plate. Most surviving examples are either in the hands of hardcore Ford historians or were re-imported from Europe decades later. For collectors, they're interesting conversation pieces precisely because they represent a misstep. A moment when Ford misread the American small car market and discovered the hard way that you can't just shrink a domestic design, bolt in a small engine, and expect it to sell. If you didn't already though, Ford sold it here. Well, you're not alone. Most people don't, and Ford would probably prefer it stayed that way.
The 1963 Studebaker Avanti is one of those cars whose reputation today is far better than its real-world first impression, at least if you were unlucky enough to buy one of the earliest R1 automatic versions. When it debuted, the Avanti was meant to be Studebaker's Hail Mary pass, a bold, futuristic halo car designed to rejuvenate a struggling company. Penned by Raymond Loewy's design team, it had a low, shark-like nose with no grille, clean, sculpted flanks, and a swept rear end that looked like nothing else on American roads in 1963. Studebaker pitched it as a high-performance, high-style machine that could take on the likes of the Corvette, Thunderbird, and Jaguar E-Type. On paper, it was supposed to be the perfect blend of American muscle and European sophistication. But if you were one of the first customers to buy an R1 Avanti with an automatic transmission, the illusion evaporated the moment you put your foot down. The R1 was powered by a 289 cubic inch V8 producing around 240 horsepower, which sounded healthy. The problem wasn't the engine itself. In manual form, the car could be lively, but the pairing with Studebaker's aging Borg-Warner 3-speed automatic, combined with an excessively tall final drive ratio. This combination blunted the car's acceleration so badly that early magazine road tests were brutal. Car Life called it styling without substance, and Motor Trend reported 0 to 60 miles per hour times creeping toward 12 seconds, which was downright embarrassing for a car marketed as a performance icon. In an era when even full-sized family sedans could beat that, the Avanti's glamour took a hit.
And then there was the build quality. The Avanti was Studebaker's first fiberglass-bodied production car, and they rushed it into production to meet an ambitious release schedule. That was a recipe for trouble. The fiberglass panels were made by the same subcontractor that built Corvette bodies, but the Avanti's complex curves and compound surfaces made it far more difficult to manufacture consistently. Early cars often suffered from mismatched panel gaps, waviness in the bodywork, and doors that didn't quite align or seal properly. Some even left the factory with hoods that didn't fit flush, requiring dealers to grind or shim them to close. Owners complained of squeaks and rattles from day one, especially as the car's stiff frame transmitted every road imperfection into the cabin. Inside, the Avanti looked the part of a luxury GT with its aircraft-inspired dash, full gauge cluster, and bucket seats, but buyers expecting Cadillac-level refinement were in for another shock. The interior trim was prone to coming loose, chrome pieces pitted early, and some of the vinyl warped in heat. For a car that cost more than many full-size Oldsmobiles or Buicks, and almost as much as a Corvette, it felt unfinished. The cruel irony was that Studebaker had developed far more potent versions of the Avanti, the supercharged R2 and later R3, that truly delivered on performance. But by the time those were available, the damage to the car's reputation was already done. Word had gotten around that the early automatics were dogs, and in the low-volume world of niche performance cars, bad press is fatal. Production delays didn't help either. Many customers who placed early deposits waited months, sometimes nearly a year for delivery, only to find their long-anticipated performance masterpiece underwhelming. For some, that was the final straw. There are period accounts of buyers refusing delivery altogether after a single test drive. Today, enthusiasts remember the Avanti as a design icon, and the later, hotter versions have a cult following. But if you strip away the romantic hindsight and look at the early R1 automatics in context, you can see why they were such a letdown in 1963. They were beautiful to look at, yes, but also slow, rattly, and sometimes awkwardly assembled. More than one disappointed owner must have sat at a stoplight, glancing at their futuristic fiberglass coupe reflected in the store window, and wondered why their halo car was being left behind by the family sedans they were supposed to embarrass. If you'd like, I can also do a similarly detailed write-up for another infamous underperformer from the same era. The 1967 Mercury Cougar XR7 GTE 7.0 is a classic example of American muscle car excess pushed to impractical extremes. A car that many enthusiasts now treasure for its rarity and brute power, but which, at the time, caused no small amount of frustration among owners and mechanics alike. Introduced during the peak muscle car era, the Cougar XR7 GTE was Mercury's attempt to blend luxury coupe refinement with bone-crushing performance, and stuffing the massive 427 cubic inch 7.0-liter V8 into the engine bay was supposed to cement its position as a serious contender against rivals like the Chevrolet Chevelle SS 427 and Pontiac GTO. On paper, it was a jaw-dropping powertrain capable of delivering raw, intimidating force. In reality, it was a heavy, front-end loaded beast that demanded more respect and maintenance than most buyers were prepared to give. The engineering challenge of shoehorning the 427 big block V8 under the Cougar's hood was immense. The car's chassis and suspension, originally designed for smaller and lighter engines, received only minimal modifications, mostly reinforced mounts and stiffer springs, which were barely enough to handle the extra weight and torque. This left the front end heavily nose down, creating handling imbalances that made the car prone to understeer and less agile than competitors with better weight distribution. Drivers reported that the car felt like it was plowing through corners with a vague and heavy steering feel that was tiring on twisty roads. The added weight and power also put intense strain on the cooling system. Many owners found that in stop-and-go traffic, especially in warmer climates, the Cougar would overheat unless fitted with upgraded radiators or electric fans, neither of which were standard from the factory.
This overheating issue led to premature wear on engine components, fueling frustration among buyers who expected a reliable, high-performance coupe. One of the most infamous maintenance headaches was the accelerated wear on the front tires. The massive torque output, combined with the heavy front end and relatively basic suspension geometry, caused front tires to wear out quickly, sometimes in less than 5,000 miles. Replacement tires were expensive, and because the XR7 GTE came with performance-oriented rubber, owners couldn't just swap them for cheap alternatives without sacrificing grip or risking damage. The brake system, though adequate for everyday driving, was often pushed to its limits when owners attempted spirited driving, contributing to a sense that the car was overmatched by its own performance ambitions. Despite its handling and maintenance flaws, the XR7 GTE did deliver an unmistakable presence on the road. With its aggressive styling cues, including special badging, unique grille treatments, and sporty interior touches like vinyl bucket seats and wood grain accents, it looked the part of a muscle luxury hybrid. The deep rumble of the 427 V8 was unmistakable, and on a straightaway, the car could hold its own with many muscle car legends. But this power came at a high cost. Poor fuel economy, expensive upkeep, and a driving experience that demanded constant vigilance rather than relaxed cruising. Ford only produced a limited number of these beasts, making them a coveted collector's item today, especially among muscle car aficionados who appreciate rare factory-built monsters. However, even many collectors admit that the XR7 GTE's charm lies mostly in its garage queen status, a car to admire and preserve rather than daily drive. Owners who tried to use it as a regular car often found themselves mired in costly repairs, with front suspension bushings, cooling system components, and tires requiring frequent attention. Looking back, the 1967 Mercury Cougar XR7 GTE 7.0 perfectly embodies the muscle car era's more is better philosophy, taken a little too far. It's a car that dared to offer both luxury and raw power, but didn't fully deliver the refinement needed to make that combo work seamlessly. Yet its rarity and brute character continue to captivate enthusiasts, preserving its place as a fascinating chapter in Ford's high-performance history. If you want, I can provide details about the specific performance figures, factory options, or notable owners who tried to tame this wild coupe.
The 1972 Ford Gran Torino Sport Fastback, equipped with the 429 Cobra Jet automatic, was, in many ways, a muscle car that wore its performance aspirations like a badge, but delivered a very different reality. A stark reminder of how much the muscle car era had shifted by the early 1970s. This car was meant to be a street-dominating beast, a powerful symbol of American automotive bravado that could effortlessly blend raw speed with striking style. Instead, it became a cautionary tale of government regulations, changing consumer expectations, and the slow unraveling of muscle car mythology under the increasing weight of emissions controls, insurance hikes, and fuel crises. To fully understand the disappointment of the 72 Gran Torino Sport with the 429 Cobra Jet automatic, you have to look back at what the engine represented just a few years prior. In the late 60s, the 429 Cobra Jet was a legendary power plant, a massive 7.0-liter V8 with forged internals, a heavy-duty camshaft, and a reputation for brutal, relentless torque. Back then, it could effortlessly launch a car to 60 miles an hour in under 6 seconds, and its thunderous exhaust note was a clarion call for muscle car enthusiasts. It was the kind of engine that made your pulse race before you even pressed the accelerator. But by 1972, the landscape was dramatically different. The federal government had mandated increasingly strict emissions regulations, forcing automakers to drastically reduce horsepower to meet new air quality standards. Insurance companies were raising premiums on high-performance cars to punishing levels, discouraging younger buyers. And the oil crises were still on the horizon, but looming, creating early consumer anxiety about fuel economy. For the Torino, these factors translated into a detuned 429 Cobra Jet that was crippled by a lower compression ratio, sometimes as low as 8.1 to 1, compared to nearly 11 to 1 just a few years before, and choked by smog-era emissions equipment. This effectively robbed the engine of its aggressive edge. The official horsepower rating in '72 dropped to around 240, nearly a 35% reduction from peak years. But ratings often didn't tell the full story. The real-world feel behind the wheel was that of a heavy, lumbering sedan struggling to get out of its own way. The torque curve was flattened, throttle response dulled, and acceleration became sluggish enough to disappoint drivers accustomed to muscle cars that could make a traffic light a launching pad rather than a crawl zone. 0 to 60 miles per hour times ballooned to well over 7 seconds, a figure that was quickly becoming pedestrian in a market where even family sedans from other manufacturers could post similar numbers. The choice of a 3-speed automatic transmission compounded the problem. While automatics were gaining popularity for convenience, this particular unit was geared towards smoothness and emissions compliance, not performance. Shift points were early and soft, designed to limit fuel consumption and emissions output rather than maximize power delivery. Drivers looking to extract any semblance of muscle car performance had to wrestle with a transmission that often felt disconnected from the engine's potential. The combination resulted in a driving experience that was more about getting from point A to point B comfortably than lighting up the quarter mile. Adding insult to injury was the car's sheer size and weight. The Gran Torino Sport Fastback tipped the scales at approximately 4,200 pounds, making it a heavyweight in its class. Its long wheelbase and broad stance gave it an imposing presence on the road, but also meant that every ounce of detuned power had to haul a massive bulk. The suspension, tuned more for comfort than aggressive handling, struggled to keep body roll in check. On curvy roads, the car leaned heavily into corners, and drivers often found themselves compensating for vague steering and unpredictable front-end grip. Its enormous turning radius made tight maneuvers and parking exercises a headache. City driving was far from the thrill that muscle car enthusiasts craved. Inside the cabin, the Torino offered a surprisingly spacious and comfortable environment, with sporty touches designed to hint at performance, vinyl bucket seats, a center console with floor shifter, although automatic versions had column shifters, and bold badging proclaiming the car's heritage. The interior quality was solid for the time, but it felt disconnected from the roaring performance image the car was supposed to embody. Instead of a track-ready cockpit, drivers were seated in what felt like a heavy cruiser's lounge. Market reaction was tepid at best. The muscle car market was fragmenting rapidly, and buyers with performance ambitions started shifting towards smaller, lighter cars, like the Ford Mustang Boss 302, Chevrolet Camaro Z28, and Dodge Challenger. The big block muscle car, represented by the Torino with its 429, was increasingly seen as a dinosaur, a heavy, expensive relic that couldn't compete with nimble pony cars or emerging imports that offered better handling and fuel economy. Dealers often struggled to move these Torinos with the heavy, detuned big block. The cars were expensive, thirsty, and lacked the exhilarating power that muscle car buyers expected. Owners who did buy them sometimes reported buyer's remorse, finding that the car's heavy weight and sluggish response made daily driving a chore rather than a joy. Fuel economy could be in the low teens or worse, and maintenance costs for the big 429 engine and associated cooling upgrades were high compared to smaller engines. This Gran Torino variant is a snapshot of the end of an era, when muscle cars were losing their muscle under a tide of regulation, insurance penalties, and shifting tastes. It looked like a street monster, sure, with aggressive fastback styling, sporty trim, badges that promised performance, but the engine under the hood had been shackled to the point where it could barely deliver muscle car thrills. Today, surviving examples of the '72 Gran Torino Sport Fastback 429 Cobra Jet Automatic are a rare breed, often prized by collectors as a last hurrah from the big block muscle era. They represent a fascinating blend of ambition and compromise, a car that tried to balance luxury, size, and power, but ended up being heavy, slow, and something of a muscle car paradox. All show, not much go.
If you want, I can go deeper into the specifics of the emissions equipment that hampered this car, or share period reviews and owner anecdotes about living with a muscle car that forgot to flex. The 1975 Chevrolet Monza V8 is a fascinating and frustrating chapter in General Motors' attempt to blend the muscle car ethos with the burgeoning market for compact, sporty coupes in the early to mid-1970s. While the Monza line was initially conceived to provide affordable, stylish transportation with a hint of performance, the decision to bolt a V8 engine into the chassis was emblematic of an industry struggling to balance power, emissions, safety regulations, and consumer demand. The end result was a car that on paper promised muscle car thrills in a compact package, but in reality suffered from fundamental engineering oversights and design compromises that alienated both enthusiasts and mechanics alike. From the start, the Chevrolet Monza was not designed to be a muscle car. Its origins lay in the Pontiac-derived H-body platform, created for lightweight, economical vehicles meant to compete against imports and domestic small cars. The standard Monza came with modest 4- or 6-cylinder engines, emphasizing fuel economy and affordability. However, amid growing pressure from muscle car fans and competitors offering compact V8-powered models, GM decided to offer a V8 option in the Monza, particularly the 305 and 350 cubic inch small block engines. The idea was to give buyers a sporty, powerful alternative in a package smaller than traditional muscle cars like the Camaro or Chevelle. This concept, while attractive on paper, posed enormous packaging challenges. The Monza's engine bay was simply not engineered from the ground up to house such large power plants. Engineers had to work within severe space constraints, leaving little room around the engine for routine maintenance tasks. The spark plugs, a maintenance item every car owner must eventually access, became a symbol of the Monza's fundamental flaw. Unlike the relatively easy access found on other V8-powered cars of the era, the Monza's tight quarters meant that replacing spark plugs required removing or loosening the entire engine, an ordeal that transformed a job typically done in an hour or less into a full-day project. For many owners, this translated into expensive mechanic bills or the daunting prospect of tackling repairs themselves with limited space and awkward angles. But the spark plugs were just the beginning of the maintenance nightmare. The cramped engine bay also made adjusting the carburetor, replacing the distributor, servicing the cooling system, or swapping belts and hoses a frustrating test of patience and ingenuity. Mechanics often reported spending more time disassembling and maneuvering around the engine than performing the actual repairs. The car's design was a textbook case of marketing ambitions outstripping engineering practicality. GM was eager to slap a V8 badge on the Monza, but it paid scant attention to the real-world consequences of this decision for owners and technicians. Beyond maintenance woes, the Monza V8 struggled on the road as well. While the 350 cubic inch V8 in its various configurations produced between 165 and 245 horsepower, which was competitive for the segment, the Monza's suspension and chassis were not upgraded proportionally to handle the extra power and weight. This mismatch led to a car that often felt unbalanced and unsettled when pushed hard. Front-end weight bias from the hefty engine caused noticeable understeer, and the factory suspension settings prioritized comfort over control, leading to excessive body roll on corners. Tires wore unevenly, and braking distances were longer than expected, as the original brake components were not sufficiently beefed up to cope with the V8's grunt. Inside the cabin, the Monza attempted to appeal to younger buyers with sporty instrumentation and available bucket seats, but the overall interior quality and refinement remained modest. The sporty image projected by the V8 badge was undermined by the car's sometimes sluggish acceleration, particularly when models paired with the automatic transmission, and the knowledge among buyers and enthusiasts that the car was a compromise at best. The Monza V8 felt like a muscle car in spirit, but fell short in execution. From the perspective of owners and mechanics, the Monza V8's design failures became the stuff of legend. One mechanic famously joked, If you want to change the spark plugs, bring an engine hoist and a lot of patience. Such wry humor underscored the frustration with the car's impractical packaging and foreshadowed the growing disillusionment with compact muscle cars in general as the muscle car era waned. Many owners were drawn to the Monza's sleek fastback styling and the allure of a V8, only to find themselves bogged down by frequent, complicated repairs and the constant need for maintenance that was far more demanding than on comparable vehicles. In the broader context, the 1975 Chevrolet Monza V8 represents a moment when American automakers were scrambling to meet changing market demands. The muscle car bubble was bursting under government regulation and insurance pressures, and consumers were increasingly looking for practicality and fuel efficiency. The Monza V8 was a stopgap solution, an attempt to hold on to muscle car cachet while transitioning to a new era of smaller, more economical vehicles. Unfortunately, GM's rush to market without fully engineering the car for a V8 powertrain left many with a car that promised muscle but delivered headaches. Today, surviving examples of the Monza V8 are rare and often valued by collectors for their quirky place in automotive history. They stand as a reminder of an industry at a crossroads, caught between the desire to offer exciting performance and the realities of tightening regulations and changing consumer priorities. While the Monza V8 never achieved muscle car legend status, its story is a testament to the complexities and compromises of automotive design during one of America's most tumultuous eras for car culture. If you want, I can share detailed accounts from owners, mechanic interviews, or compare the Monza V8's failings with other compact muscle cars that managed the balance more successfully, like the Ford Mustang II Cobra or the Dodge Dart Swinger V8.
The 1980 AMC Spirit AMX serves as a vivid example of American Motors Corporation's struggles in the late 1970s and early 1980s to reconcile its storied muscle car heritage with the harsh realities of a transforming automotive market. The original AMX of the late 1960s was a lean, hard-hitting muscle car, light, nimble, and bristling with power, a genuine competitor to the likes of the Ford Mustang and Chevrolet Camaro. By contrast, the Spirit AMX was a compact hatchback, designed primarily for economy and practicality, with only superficial sporty touches to differentiate it from its less ambitious Spirit siblings. AMC's decision to revive the AMX badge on this economy car was less an effort to rekindle muscle car glory and more a marketing gambit, one that ended up alienating hardcore enthusiasts while failing to capture new buyers looking for genuine performance. Stylistically, AMC went all in on the Spirit AMX's visual appeal to compensate for its lack of true muscle under the hood. The car featured an array of bold and, some would say, garish decals, racing stripes, and bright color schemes meant to evoke excitement and speed. Large rear spoilers, hood scoops, often non-functional, and pronounced side moldings aimed to give the impression of a car ready to attack twisty roads. But in reality, these elements often resembled an over-the-top sticker kit slapped onto a fundamentally unremarkable vehicle. The Spirit AMX looked like a car trying very hard to say sporty, but lacking the hardware to back up the claim. Under this flashy exterior was a powertrain lineup that was decidedly underwhelming, especially compared to the muscle cars of the past. The base engine was a 2.0-liter four-cylinder that produced roughly 80 horsepower, an anemic figure even by 1980 standards. AMC also offered a 2.5-liter four-cylinder, and for those seeking a little more oomph, a 3.8-liter inline-six that made about 110 horsepower. These engines, designed for fuel efficiency and economy, struggled to propel the Spirit AMX with any real enthusiasm. Acceleration was sluggish, and freeway passing maneuvers required careful planning. Enthusiasts expecting the thunderous rumble and raw power once associated with the AMX nameplate were met instead with the dull drone of a low-output engine under strain. The car's chassis and suspension setup reflected AMC's priorities at the time: economy and cost savings over handling and performance. The Spirit AMX rode on a basic suspension with soft springs and compliant shocks that were more suited for comfort than spirited driving. Cornering resulted in pronounced body roll, with the car feeling unstable and disconnected from the driver's inputs. Steering was light but vague, lacking the precision muscle car fans craved. Braking performance was adequate for city driving but uninspiring when pushed harder, with long pedal travel and modest stopping power. Inside, the Spirit AMX tried to maintain an affordable and functional cabin, but quality control issues quickly surfaced. Hard plastics, rattling panels, and cheap upholstery were common complaints among owners. While sporty bucket seats were offered, they did little to elevate the overall feel of the interior. The bright exterior colors and flashy decals were not matched by an equally engaging or refined driving environment, creating a disconnect that frustrated buyers looking for a genuine performance experience. From a marketing standpoint, AMC's use of the AMX badge on the Spirit hatchback was widely criticized. The original AMX had earned a loyal following due to its aggressive styling and genuine performance capabilities. But the Spirit AMX diluted that legacy. Many muscle car purists saw the new AMX as little more than a sticker job on a mundane economy car, a cynical attempt to cash in on a famous name. One longtime AMC fan lamented, "It felt like AMC was selling us a ghost, a shadow of what the AMX was meant to be." This sentiment was echoed by automotive journalists who derided the Spirit AMX as a roller skate with racing stripes and a performance pretender. Sales figures reflected the market's lukewarm reception. While the Spirit AMX attracted some younger buyers looking for affordable style, it failed to win over the muscle car faithful or serious performance enthusiasts. It was overshadowed by competitors who managed to deliver real performance in compact packages, such as the Ford Mustang II Cobra and the Chevrolet Camaro's own smaller engine offerings. AMC's limited resources and aging platform meant they were fighting an uphill battle against better-funded and more innovative rivals. In retrospect, the 1980 AMC Spirit AMX stands as a poignant symbol of a company struggling to survive in a changing automotive landscape. The muscle car era was fading fast, and AMC's attempt to keep the AMX name alive on a budget hatchback was both a marketing misstep and a reflection of the industry's broader challenges. The Spirit AMX is remembered today not for its performance or engineering, but for its bold styling attempts and its role as a footnote in the history of one of America's most storied yet beleaguered automakers. For collectors and enthusiasts, the Spirit AMX holds a certain quirky charm as a relic of a transitional period. It serves as a reminder of how far muscle cars had fallen by the dawn of the 1980s, and how manufacturers grappled with balancing heritage, regulation, and consumer demand. If you want, I can dive even deeper into detailed specifications, sales numbers, owner testimonials, or how the Spirit AMX compares to contemporaneous sporty compacts that either succeeded or failed in capturing the spirit of performance during this era.
The 1993 Cadillac Avanti stands as one of the most ambitious yet fundamentally flawed experiments in Cadillac's long history. A car born from a grand vision to blend European styling finesse with American luxury and power, but hampered by a bewildering production process, high costs, and disappointing performance that left both critics and buyers disillusioned. The Avanti's story is as much about its unusual creation as it is about the car itself, a saga that highlights the challenges American automakers faced trying to compete on a global stage during the early 1990s. The Avanti began life as Cadillac's bold answer to the rising tide of European luxury convertibles flooding the American market, such as the Mercedes-Benz SL and the BMW 6 Series. To compete, Cadillac decided decided to pair Italian coach builder Pininfarina's legendary design expertise with their own chassis and engineering, hoping to deliver a car that combined exotic European styling with traditional American comfort and refinement. On paper, the idea was dazzling. Pininfarina would craft the aluminum bodies by hand in Italy, then each body shell would be flown across the Atlantic aboard custom-equipped Boeing 747s dubbed the Alante Air Bridge, where they'd be joined with the chassis and powertrain in Detroit. This transatlantic production ballet, while unique and ambitious, introduced massive logistical complexity and astronomical costs. Shipping fragile bodies thousands of miles just to marry them with American mechanical components inflated the Alante's production expenses far beyond comparable luxury convertibles. The result was a car that cost nearly twice as much to build as other Cadillacs and yet offered little that truly justified the premium price tag. Performance was another sore spot. The 1993 model came equipped with a 4.6-liter Northstar V8, Cadillac's then new DOHC 32-valve engine, promising smoother power delivery and more refined performance. While it produced a respectable 295 horsepower, the Alante's heavy curb weight and somewhat soft suspension blunted the driving experience. Acceleration was adequate, but hardly thrilling, and handling felt ponderous compared to its European rivals. Steering was numb, and the chassis lacked the agility that buyers paying European prices expected. In many ways, it felt like a Cadillac first and an exotic roadster second. Comfortable, quiet, and plush, but lacking in driving excitement. Reliability issues further plagued the Alante's reputation. Early models suffered from electrical gremlins, troublesome body panel fitment, and problems related to the complex production logistics. The aluminum body panels required specialized repair techniques, making even minor accidents expensive to fix. Owners reported issues with the convertible top mechanisms as well as quirks in the electronics and climate control systems. Service and parts were costly and not always readily available, which dissuaded many prospective buyers. Styling, while elegant and clean, was another area where the Alante struggled to find its footing. Although Pininfarina's work gave it a sleek, understated profile, the design lacked the boldness or distinctive character that might have set it apart. It looked more like a restrained European cruiser than the flamboyant, attention-grabbing Cadillac many expected. At the same time, it didn't quite fit the conservative tastes of Cadillac's traditional customer base, leaving it in a design no man's land. Critics often described it as bland or safe, a car that failed to excite visually despite its exotic pedigree. Price, arguably, was the nail in the coffin. The Alante sticker price was steep, often approaching or exceeding $60,000 in early 90s dollars, putting it in direct competition with true European luxury sports cars that offered superior performance, refinement, and brand cachet. For a car with a complex, expensive production pipeline, middling performance, and reliability headaches, the value proposition simply didn't add up. Sales reflected this harsh reality. The Alante struggled to find buyers throughout its production run from 1987 to 1993, and Cadillac discontinued it after the 93 model year without a direct replacement. It became a curious footnote in Cadillac's history, an exotic experiment that failed to live up to expectations and highlighted the difficulties faced by American luxury brands trying to reinvent themselves during a challenging era. Today, the Cadillac Alante is often remembered as a collectible oddity, admired by some for its rare blend of Italian design and American luxury, but criticized for its impractical production approach and unfulfilled promise. If you want, I can expand on specific mechanical issues, share detailed owner testimonials, or compare the Alante to its European contemporaries to further highlight where it fell short or succeeded.
The 2006 Dodge Magnum SRT8 AWD prototype is one of those tantalizing what-could-have-been stories in American performance car lore, an ambitious muscle wagon concept that promised thrilling power and all-weather capability, but ultimately ultimately collapsed under the weight of its own engineering challenges and impracticalities. When Chrysler unveiled the Magnum SRT8 in the mid-2000s, it was already a bold move to revive the classic muscle wagon concept with a brutal 425 horsepower, 6.1-liter Hemi V8. But the idea to add all-wheel drive, or AWD, to the SRT8 to improve traction and year-round usability opened a Pandora's box of complications that doomed the project before it ever reached production. The Magnum SRT8 was conceived to offer muscle car performance with the added versatility of a wagon body style, appealing to enthusiasts who wanted both speed and utility. Dodge's engineering team knew the rear-wheel drive SRT8 was impressive, but saw AWD as a way to enhance grip, especially in slippery conditions, and broaden the car's appeal in markets with harsh winters. The testing and engineering team recognized that the AWD could make the car even more desirable, but almost immediately testers and engineers began raising red flags. The biggest problem was weight. The AWD hardware, transfer case, extra drive shafts, rear differential, and associated suspension modifications added a massive amount of heft to a car that was already no lightweight. The Magnum SRT8's curb weight ballooned significantly, shifting the vehicle's balance and making it feel lumbering and unresponsive. Test drivers often described the AWD prototype as feeling like driving a safe deposit box, heavy, slow to turn in, and lacking the nimble, aggressive character that made the rear-wheel drive SRT8 thrilling. Handling was compromised too. The AWD system added complexity that upset the suspension tuning and threw off weight distribution, leading to vague steering feedback and increased understeer. The car's suspension, originally calibrated for a rear-drive muscle wagon with a potent V8, struggled to adapt to the new drivetrain's demands. Braking performance suffered as well, with the increased mass extending stopping distances. Under the hood, the familiar 6.1-liter Hemi V8 still produced its trademark grunt, but the AWD system's added drag and weight sapped much of the performance gains. Acceleration times lagged behind the standard SRT8, and the exhaust note felt dulled, as if the car's ferocity had been muffled beneath layers of cumbersome hardware. Moreover, the packaging challenges were severe. Fitting the AWD components under the Magnum's wagon body compromised interior space, cargo room, and ground clearance, limiting the practicality that buyers would have expected. The already wide and aggressive stance of the Magnum SRT8 became even bulkier, making city driving and parking more cumbersome. Faced with these insurmountable issues, Chrysler quietly shelved the AWD SRT8 Magnum project before it ever reached production. While the standard RWD SRT8 went on to enjoy moderate success and a dedicated fanbase, the AWD version was never officially released. However, a small number of pre-production prototype vehicles, sometimes called mules, escaped the factory and ended up in private hands, becoming highly coveted collector's items due to their rarity and the story behind their failure. These prototype AWD Magnums serve as a fascinating reminder that even the best engineering teams sometimes have to say no when an idea, however promising on paper, simply doesn't work in practice. The Magnum SRT8 AWD is an automotive cautionary tale of ambition running up against physics and practicality, illustrating how crucial balance, weight, and handling are to performance vehicles. Today, these rare prototypes live mostly in private collections or enthusiast garages, quietly showcasing what might have been a game changer for American muscle wagons, had it not been weighed down into oblivion. If you want, I can dive deeper into technical specs of the AWD system, anecdotal experiences from test drivers, or comparisons to other AWD performance wagons that succeeded or failed during that era.